Hey everybody, it's Mr. Verzat. This video is going to look at how to focus on proportion when using the form building exercise. Proportion is very critical. Proportion is how you know where to put different parts of your form together. Proportion is how you know how big to make those different parts. It's one thing to identify the shapes. It's another thing entirely to make sure that they're put together properly. Because what makes a turtle and not a guinea pig both have heads, bodies, and limbs. If you don't understand proportion, you may risk having a completely different species on your paper. Looking at your work so far in class, I see that you guys are really good at identifying, like the basic shapes of a form. Identification is the first half of one skill, though. The skill itself is the identification and the ability to place it properly. And proportion is the largest challenge that students face with this exercise. Here's why. Here's a picture of a smiley face person, a little stick man. Whoop, okay, now you look at this little picture right here, and your job is to draw it on a separate sheet of paper. Now your eyes, here's your eyeball, will look at this image, and your eyes see what is there, all right? The light bounces off the image, it goes to your eye just like any camera lens, and then it goes over to your brain. Now your brain is where some of this stuff might get a little messed up. What you see in your head might be entirely different than what ends up on the paper. You might have a stick man that looks like this, and he's kind of sad. All right, so what happens here? This is what we call drawing by sight. Drawing by sight is when you look at something and then what you think you see, which is a perfect stick man, give him a smiley face, comes out, and something gets lost between here and here. There's a disconnect. Now, what that disconnect means is that an understanding of how this stick figure is put together is the thing that's overlooked, okay? Sometimes what frustrates beginning students the most is that they say to me, man, every time I draw it, it's all screwed up, all right? Well, the reason for that is because you need to understand how this form works before you can properly reconstruct it. It's kind of like building a house and winging it. If you built a house and you just kind of went from ground level up from scratch, you might end up with a house that has two walls that are different heights, and your roof now is going to be crooked and it's going to fall off and the whole thing might just collapse, okay? You need to have a plan. You need to know exactly what's going on with that house. And so you'd learn that, let's say, going back to my analogy with a triangle, if your triangle's looking weird, then study how a triangle works. And we start with that scaffold, okay? And you'll know that a triangle is kind of a bad scaffold, but a triangle is symmetrical, all right? And so if you understand the function, like what these degrees add up to and so on, okay, then it'll always turn out correct. The only thing that might be wrong with a triangle that you draw is, maybe you've got developing motor skills. And so like your lines might be a little off on some parts. That all changes with time, but you could create any variety of triangles, just by understanding their function. And so because of this disconnect, what we're going to do is we're going to bridge this with objective things, absolutes, things that are measurable, things that are, you can't argue with. And that's what proportion deals with. So students who have trouble in the class reproducing this, aside from rough motor skill, can still get, an accurately proportioned stick man if they use the measurement techniques, okay? So the first thing that matters is it really doesn't matter how big your reference is physically, all right? If you're measuring a form against itself, you could take a small little picture the size of a postage stamp and draw it on like humongous paper. It doesn't matter. because you're dealing with absolutes and measurement here. All right. So because of that, we're going to zoom out, and I'm going to make a large drawing based on this small one to demonstrate the skill to you. So step one, as you guys all know with form building, is find a shape that you can begin with. I'm going to start with the head because the head looks like a pretty good unit of measurement. I'm going to draw that head pretty large. We're probably going to capture, this much of the image. So that head shape is an oval. I'm going to start. Make sure you ghost the form until you feel its shape. Remember, this is sensation based, all right? All right, now one thing to pay attention to with this form is that he is kind of flat on top. He's a blocky oval. And so when you drop that shape, don't be afraid to go in there and sculpt a little bit. I'm gonna go in here and kind of straighten out this edge a little bit. And another thing that's critical is you need to have a scaffold on top of which to build. You're gonna see me oftentimes find center in my image. That was totally off. Holy smokes. There we go. You're going to usually see me find center in an image so that I can kind of think in 3D. I encourage you guys to do that as well, a lot. And now I'm just going to kind of tweak the shape a little bit. He's got a bit of a curved forehead up there. Let's start with an eye, and so here would be like the direct, here'd be the direct middle of the overall form. His eye is slightly off center because he's looking at us that way. All right, that's foreshortening. So his eyeball is going to be right about here. Let's find where that cute little mouth of his is. It's about the same, if this is like the halfway point, it's a little bit lower than halfway. So you see how when I'm even just doing this head, I'm measuring this form against itself. I'm finding units of measurement within it. All right, so how far out do we make the mouth? Well, let's look at his eye. Here's one eye, and then from that eye, if we duplicate that, it is like 2 1/4 or 2 1/3 eyes. And yes, you do get this specific when you work. So 1, 2 1/3. So his little mouth is going to come out about that far. And you can go about doing this for the entire head until the drawing is entirely, finished up. But we're not going to go quite that deep. So now let's finish the rest of the turtle. So here's his head shape. Let's see how far out his leg goes, all the way to its outermost corner, okay? So here's his head. So if this counts as 1, like 0, here's one head shape. And so it doesn't go all the way past. It's right about there. So that's about 2/3 of a head size out. That's how far out his leg goes. Now this goes on in an artist's mind. As they're drawing, they're constantly looking at it and thinking, okay, where's this go? Where's that go? And they're doing this at high speed. You only get that fast by doing a lot of it. So here's one head length, and let's shave off 1/3. And so if I make a little mark right here, that's as far out as his leg's gonna go. As you draw, always make little guide marks just to kind of help you work. Okay, so now let's see like how high his leg goes. And so I'm going to use his unit of measurement here. And so here's like the height of his leg. As a matter of fact, you know what? It lines up right with that little corner of the mouth for height. So let's do that with our drawing. Here's the corner of his mouth. That is as high as it should be. Let's see how like thick his leg is. You see it has like this curve. So right like in from his cheek down, boom. That's about where it is located on his overall head shape. This area right here. Here is where we're gonna go out in terms of thickness. All right, so here's 0 heads. Here's 1 head. And you know what? About 1 head height, maybe a little past, is where ground is. 1 head height. So right about here, just a little past. This is about where his foot is going to be. Now all we've got to do is just start building it with basic shapes. And if we look at the shapes, we could probably jam a tilted egg shape in there on top of a cylinder. We could build, like a stick first, and then, it's really up to you and how you want to pull that off. But what's most important is that you get correct proportion. And here is our cylinder shape, and here's our sideways egg. It does kind of go in and curve. I'm going to sculpt him up a little bit. And he's flat on the top. And yes, you do pay close attention to these little angles here. And he curves back in and then down. All right. We can't really see what's going on here because the gravel's in the way. I'm going to clean this up because it just looks like crud. One fun thing you can do in your drawings is, draw very, very lightly as you work. I'm sure it's hard to see this on the screen. And only push hard when you're going to really refine or pull out the major shapes. It almost looks like something's grown out of his face. Here's where the ground is, go right across, and a little, probably because he's on a hill and it's curved, but his leg is a little bit above this one. So let's go over to our drawing, and we can look and think a little bit lower, and so around this region is where his leg's gonna be. All right, now let's find out where the next top of his leg is. So here's the top of his leg, and let's connect from the top. Where on his face does it match? I'm going to use the head again. So right about the bottom quarter. So what would a quarter of this look like? Well, here's halfway. Divide that in half. That's the quarter right there. So right around this region is where the height of his limb is. And so we're going to make a little line there. And this goes on in your mind, okay? If you want to write this on the paper, hey, that's totally cool too. So now let's figure out, where does the side of his leg start? Like right here. I'm sure you guessed it. Let's use his head. It's within like a third of the head thickness away, okay? So about that big of a gap. So let's do that big of a gap. Now we got to figure out what the angle is where it slants. There's a couple ways you can do that. First of all, you could just ghost over the line like so, and then try to match that same angle. So he is about 1.5 heads over, and that's where his the edge of his foot will stop. So let's measure 1.5 heads thickness. So here's 1, and then 1/2. So here's pretty much where his foot's going to be, and now we draw it. So we know where it begins, we know how far out it goes, we know where the ground is, and there's where his leg is. All right, how thick is his leg? All right, how thick does this fella get? That little fella takes up quite a bit of his head size. I'd say 2/3 of his head thickness. So let's look over here and let's bust him up into thirds. So here's 1/3, here's another. That means his leg is about that thick. So that translates to about this thick at its thickest point. And you see it gets narrower at the top. So he's going to curve, and he's also going to go straight and then curve again. Pay very close attention to the outside angles that you see over here. Straight, curve, got a curve, and a bit of straight angle curve. It's kind of a rhombus shape. Let's clean this up. This looks like a lot of work. It's only looking like a lot of work because I'm going through it in great detail. And yes, as a beginner, this is gonna be like a lot of work. Remember, how to get better at something is strictly mileage. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through this exact same process, and I'm going to finish a large portion of this turtle using the same techniques that you've seen me do so far. I'm going to zoom into the head, and let's do the exact same thing with the head that I've done with the body so far in order to get accurate proportions. So you saw a lot happening there. You saw that I went right up to like detail mode here. I haven't taught you guys how to do that yet in this class. You'll learn. But the concept was exactly the same. Let's look at this area and compare it over here. Do you see how these claws, for example, like one of them comes up, to the halfway point. Well, if we go down to one of the other claws right over here, the same thing is happening. One of them comes up to the halfway point of the other one. I was constantly doing that as I was measuring, as I was drawing his legs, and that's pretty complex form. Okay, there's a lot of stuff going on in there. It's the same process, whether you're doing on a large scale, comparing where forms are at in relationship to each other, or on a very small scale, like comparing how thick his eyebrow is compared to how big his eye is, and where his nostrils are in relationship to like how far or how high up on his face all this is. And my mind was constantly in motion. There was not a single point where there was like zone out. So this is a mentally taxing process, and it does get easier the more that you do it. And if you get to the point where what you draw, it's like super easy, then just increase the complexity of the thing that you're trying to draw. So like this was harder than this for me. This thing was really easy. This one was really hard. It just depends on your skill level. And the more practice you got, the more you'll be able to do. But again, it all boils down to mileage. Are you practicing it? Are you doing it? And that's the secret. It's hard at first, gets easier with time. All right, I hope this was helpful, you guys. I look forward to seeing you in class, and I'll see you then. Later.